What if I told you you could spend less time in prep and get better results at your table? Sound good? It's better than that, and we're starting right now. If this is your first visit and you want tips and tricks to make your role-playing games a little bit more awesome, start now by subscribing and hitting the bell so you can stay in the know. When I started DMing way back in the 90s, I had a bunch of problems that may sound familiar. I spent huge amounts of time building details of my setting that my players never saw. I developed interesting NPCs that they never talked to, or worse yet, they killed on sight. I built intricate stories that completely failed to hook my players, leaving a hole in my soul. And I built way more encounters and clever dialogue than I ever got to use. The result? I felt like I spent forever in prep, and some of my best work never saw the light of day. If any of these things sound familiar, stay tuned, because this and the next few videos are for you. Today, we are going to talk about prep, that thing that we all have to do as GMs and DMs, which most of us would probably rather not do, or at least do less of. Part of it is the problem. Part of it is the approach, and we are going to talk about both with some practical solutions, especially if you build your own content. But first, let's talk about a problem. Here's the situation. We are going to talk a little bit about video games, since most of you will be familiar with them, and because I've been building them professionally for a really long time. Let's consider a decision tree, maybe plot points, maybe dialogue, maybe combat encounters, blam. At every node, we get a branching point where the players make a decision. After that, we go to a new node describing a different situation. Nodes tend to have different details, most of which are distinct and build from prior decisions. Try drawing one of these guys and you'll quickly realize that the more levels and the more outcomes you have, the more nodes you have. And at some point, the whole thing starts buckling under its own dang weight. Worse yet, if this is how you prep your campaign, I can guarantee you're not using most of your content. But this isn't actually how we make video games. This is how we do it. Not what you expected? These days, stuff like art, dialogue, and encounter building are awfully expensive, not to mention all the plumbing that has to go with it, all of which has to be correct or things don't work. As a result, most big-budget games tend to be as frugal as possible with their content. And the best way to be frugal? Use and reuse as much of it as you possibly can. If you've ever wondered why so many video games have linear storylines with only the vestiges of player choice, this is why. Video games are stuck with a toady that will do only what it's told to do and can't do any creative interpretations at all. You do not have this problem. You have a thinking meat brain living up in your coconut that can adapt on the fly. But we can learn from this approach and apply to our problem. What's good in this picture? Most of the content gets used, assuming the player presses the right buttons anyway. We just talked about how expensive this stuff is, but your prep time is expensive too. It's not like you're getting that time back. The best you can do is focus on the content that's important, the stuff that your players will see. If only you knew what the players were going to do, then you could build a heck of a lot less stuff and save a bunch of time. But how do you do that? Stay away from the stone. The more concretely we write the details of our game, the more fragile they become. All it takes is one small deviation, up there near the top of our decision tree where our plot hooks live, and the whole thing comes tumbling down, and all the king's men will not be able to help. It's especially bad if we don't leave space to fill in the bits we need. There is a reason that DMs and GMs have a reputation as frustrated authors. We do this to ourselves. As if you can predict where your players are going to go for the entirety of the campaign. And stay tuned for some advice about that. What if you could limit the rigidity of your prep so it could be more malleable to fit whatever needs present themselves? Wouldn't that be cool? I like to think in terms of set pieces, not setting, and decision points, not plot. Some pieces will absolutely benefit from being heavily detailed. Your boss fights, your big reveals, your twists, your signature pieces. But most other encounters and plot points don't require this. Use the appropriate tool for the job at hand, and don't forget to leave space to change stuff if you need to. And that brings us to... players move in mysterious ways. Your players will often telegraph their moves, usually very heavily if you know what to look for. Listen to them when they discuss during the game. Bonus points if you have a Discord or Facebook group where you can read what they're thinking away from the table. Encourage them to share their thought process. Do it mechanically if you have to. Engage with them when they do so. Sometimes a slight nudge is all it takes to entice them down the most interesting path. And if you want to see this in action, Matt Colville talks about this frequently in his campaign diaries. Lean into the logistics of your game if you can. For those of you in high magic systems like 5th edition, this becomes an awful lot harder, but it isn't intractable. If you can tie your player characters to an area, obligation, or belief, you've at least got a fighting chance to know where they're going to be next session. This comes up a lot here, but it's a pretty dang good way to get your players to do what you want, even if they would rather go murder some goblins for their lunch money. If you're building your campaigns from your player character's beliefs, you're already ahead of the game. And if you've done this correctly, one or more of your player characters is already hooked. Next, get as many of the rest of them on board as you possibly can. As long as they're engaged, you can almost lead them around by the nose to the next bits of your content. And note that you can totally do this too well, where the party wants to pursue way more of your threads than they can manage. Then, dear viewer, you've got them. But we can do better than that. Go anywhere, be anything. Like I mentioned earlier, I try to think in terms of set pieces, not settings, and decision points, not plot. So how the heck do you do that? If you take apart a finished campaign, you get a list of encounters. Some of those are social, and some of those are beating up bads for their lunch money. Each one of these should move the narrative forward, and if you string stuff together with good motivations and interesting consequences, blam, you've got your campaign. Hopefully tailored to your particular table and your collective interests. You know, the themes you're exploring. If you take apart an encounter, you also get a small set of ingredients. You get the setting, where and when the scene is, the actors, the characters in the scene, the motivation, why the scene is happening in the first place, and the consequences, what happens as a result of the decisions and actions after the scene. Without proper motivation, no one's really sure why anything is happening, which makes everything feel really out of touch. And each of your encounters has to move your campaign forward in a real way, because table time is precious, and we don't want to waste it on filler. The first two, less important. Why? Most encounters can be stripped of their setting and be just as compelling as long as you have good motivation. And a lot of the times, the actors aren't even that important. What if you could switch out the setting and or the actors on a whim? The motivation still has to be there, and there still has to be some kind of consequence to have real meaning. But if you can build your encounters this way, now you can assemble your campaign from abstract building blocks that can be molded to your needs. You can also guarantee that most of your content will be used, because you can specify the details when you know them with the most confidence. You can and should still build your signature encounters with as much detail as you need. The evil bad mage is still in his tower protected by his horde of undead after all, but your bandit encounter will be just as good threatening any of the 3 villages on the border, and you know they're going to attack the ones the players are at if that's what's dramatically appropriate. Remember, the only things that are real in your game are the things that you play through at the table. The thing that really shows off the power of this approach is leaving space to follow what your players are engaging with. Prep only the things you need for, I don't know, the next 2 sessions or so. And because you haven't written things in stone, you can move them around as needed. As interest and themes shift at the table, you can mold the campaign to wherever the group wants to explore, even if the themes barely resemble where you started. All you have to do is improv well enough to keep the illusion. If there is a trick to any of this, and I'm not sure there is, it's making up enough stuff to be plausible, which brings us to the next part. A toolbox full of awesome. Imagination will bridge any gap if you give it enough time and fertile ground. You can and should use this to your advantage wherever you can. Once you get good at making your encounters setting and or actor neutral, a lot of things become easier. By changing a few of the details, you'll find you can easily repurpose content that you didn't get to use. Take advantage of the prep you've already done. You can even reuse the same encounters, and your players will never be the wiser, as long as you change enough of the details. It's like recycling for encounters. What I want is a toolbox full of awesome, and here's some of what I think is necessary. A list of interesting NPCs and setting neutral encounters that can move the thing forward, a very small number of detailed signature encounters and characters to reveal at the best dramatic moment, a bunch of modular set pieces on which to have those encounters that are more interesting than a boxing ring, a rough recipe of how the hooks fit together and where we think the narrative might flow, and finally, enough space to stitch the details together on the fly. Now, you're ready. These are some of the things that I do at my table. What are your favorite tips for increasing awesome and decreasing prep time? We would love to read your ideas down in the comments below. This is part 1 of a multi-part discussion where we delve into making prep time a little bit more awesome. To catch the next installment where we'll go into more detail, start by subscribing and hitting the bell so you can stay in the know. Thanks for staying classy, and I'll see you on Sunday.